When my son remarried, I never mentioned the $85 million my late wife left behind for him. Staying quiet turned out to be the wisest move of my life, because barely a week later, his bride showed up uninvited at my front door. A lawyer standing right beside her. "Welcome back to Dad's cruel revenge. Grab your snacks and get comfortable, because every villain in this story got exactly what they deserved. Be sure to subscribe and drop a comment. What would you have done in my place?" My name is Arthur Bishop, and I carried a secret fortune for almost a year before it nearly tore my family apart. My wife Helen died of heart failure 14 months ago, and 2 weeks after her funeral, her estate lawyer sat me down with news I never expected. Helen held a private trust, he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Patents from research she filed decades ago. It's grown into $85 million. I stared at that number like it belonged to someone else's life. Helen had spent 40 years working as a hospital lab technician, never once hinting at the wealth quietly multiplying behind our simple, ordinary marriage. She left instructions, the lawyer said. You decide when your son learns about it. My son Owen was 31, recently divorced, and just beginning to date again. I remembered something Helen used to say, money doesn't create character, it only uncovers it. Right there, I decided to lock the trust away in silence, to watch and see who entered my son's life before a single dollar of it ever surfaced. I signed the documents, shook the lawyer's hand, and drove home without telling anyone, not Owen, not my sister, not a single friend. Whatever storm this secret might eventually stir, I intended to see it coming clearly before it ever saw me. 5 months later, Owen called sounding lighter than he had in years. Dad, I met someone, he said. Her name is Claire. I think she might be it. I was cautiously happy until I actually met her. Claire was polished and quick-witted, but she asked far more questions about our family's past than about my son's present. At dinner, she brought up Helen out of nowhere. Owen mentioned his mom did some kind of medical research, she said, eyes narrowing slightly. Did she leave much behind? I told her Helen left memories, nothing more. Claire smiled like she didn't quite believe me. 3 months later, Owen and Claire were engaged. At their engagement dinner, Claire's mother pulled me aside near the bar. I hear the Bishop family has some old money tucked away, she said. Just an old house, I replied. She raised an eyebrow, filing my answer away for later use. Driving home that night, I called an old contact, a private investigator named Marcus who used to handle background checks for my company. Look into Claire before this wedding happens, I told him. 2 weeks later, Marcus handed me a folder that turned my stomach. Claire had been married once before, to a widowed accountant 9 years older, divorced within 18 months after quietly draining his retirement accounts through joint funds she'd insisted on setting up early. I stared at Helen's photograph that night. Good thing I kept quiet, I whispered. Owen and Claire married on a crisp November afternoon, and I stood through the entire ceremony wearing a smile that didn't reach past my collar. Claire hugged me afterward for the very first time. Welcome to being my father-in-law, Arthur, she said, and something in her tone felt less like affection and more like a deal closing. During the reception, she cornered me again, champagne in hand. So, nothing else from Helen's side? No investments, no property, nothing like that, she asked, keeping her tone light and casual. Just what you already see, I said. She smiled and walked off, but I caught her trading a look with her mother across the room, a patient, calculating look, like two hunters agreeing to wait for better light. A month into the marriage, Owen called, laughing. Claire wants to know if Mom left a will beyond the house, he said. She's just curious about the family history. I told him there was nothing beyond what he already knew, and he believed me completely, because sons trust their fathers without question. But behind him, I heard Claire's voice, low and insistent, ask him about her old lab too, the research place. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't idle curiosity anymore. Claire had already done her homework, and she was circling far closer to the truth than I felt comfortable allowing. It happened on a gray Wednesday morning, 7 months into their marriage. I opened my front door to find Claire standing there in a sharp-tailored suit, a man beside her gripping a leather briefcase. Arthur, this is my attorney, Mr. Langley, she said, walking straight past me into my living room, uninvited. We need to discuss Helen's estate. My pulse spiked instantly, but decades of running my own business had taught me to keep my expression perfectly still. There's no estate left to discuss, I said. Everything was settled the moment she passed. Langley opened his briefcase and set a document down on my coffee table. We believe there are undisclosed trust assets that legally should be part of Owen's marital financial disclosures, he said evenly. I actually laughed out loud. You're accusing me of hiding something, in my own home, 7 months after marrying my son. Claire's composed expression cracked for just a moment. I'm protecting my husband's future, she snapped back. Then ask your husband, I said calmly. He's never once asked me for anything. Langley tried sliding another paper toward me, a formal request for financial records. I didn't even glance at it. Get out of my house, I said quietly, before I call Owen and tell him exactly what showed up on my doorstep this morning. Claire rose slowly, straightening her jacket, her eyes suddenly cold and sharp. This isn't finished, Arthur. I held the door open wide. You're right, I said. It's only just begun. I called Owen that night, hoping to explain everything before Claire could twist the story further in her favor. Instead, I was met with silence, then anger. Dad, she said you're hiding money that should have been part of our marriage, he said, his voice tight and shaking. That's not what's happening, Owen, I said, though the words felt heavier than expected, because in some technical sense, I had been hiding something from him. Then what exactly is happening? He demanded sharply. I wasn't ready to explain yet, not with Claire whispering constantly in his ear, not with a lawyer already circling closer. I need you to trust me a little longer, I said quietly. That's not good enough, Dad. The call ended worse than any conversation we'd had in years. 4 weeks afterward, Owen barely returned my calls or texts. Claire had done exactly what predators do best. She turned my son's confusion into a wedge between us. I sat alone most nights, surrounded by Helen's old photographs, wondering if protecting Owen was quietly costing me the only family I had left. I'm trying to save him, I told Helen's picture one evening. So why does it feel like I'm losing him instead? Marcus called again with an update. Claire had already consulted 2 more attorneys about contesting the trust, and had quietly opened a private account, slowly moving funds out of the joint accounts she shared with Owen. Marcus found the piece that changed everything. Buried inside Claire's earlier divorce filing was an unsealed exhibit, a personal statement she'd once submitted during custody proceedings involving a stepchild, which revealed something far more damning than anyone expected. In her own written words, she described identifying financially secure widowers as part of what she called long-term personal security planning. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was a written confession describing exactly what she was doing to my son right now. I read the page twice, my hands trembling. There it is, Helen, I whispered toward her photograph. There's your proof, finally. I called my attorney, a meticulous, sharp-eyed woman named Diane Kessler who had handled my business affairs for 2 decades without a single misstep. I need this done properly, I told her. Not out of anger. Out of precision. Diane reviewed everything carefully, Marcus's findings, the written statement, Claire's recent financial movements, and nodded slowly, already building the framework of a case. This stopped being about protecting a trust, Arthur, she said. This is about protecting your son from deliberate fraud. We spent the following weeks quietly gathering bank records, timestamps, and witness statements, never once tipping our hand to Claire or her attorney, letting her keep circling closer to a trap she didn't yet know existed. I asked Owen to meet me alone, no Claire, just the 2 of us at the small diner we used to visit when he was a boy. He arrived guarded, arms crossed, clearly expecting another excuse from me. Instead, I slid Marcus's folder across the table without a word. Before you say anything, I said, just read this first. He opened it slowly, the earlier divorce filing, the financial pattern, and finally, the written statement in Claire's own hand. I watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like grief settling in. This can't be real, he said quietly. She loves me. Maybe part of her believes that, I said gently. But another part of her married a plan, not a person. Owen sat in heavy silence, staring at the papers as if they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less painful to accept. "Why didn't you tell me about the trust sooner?" he finally asked. "Because your mother wanted to know who truly loved you before they knew what you might inherit," I said. "And now, so do we." His hands shook as he closed the folder slowly. "What do I do now?" "You confront her," I said firmly. Calmly. With evidence in hand. "Let her show you exactly who she really is." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes, but something steadier was already settling into his shoulders. Owen confronted Claire that same night, while I waited 2 blocks away in my car, heart pounding harder than it had in years. When he finally called, his voice sounded steadier than I'd expected. "I showed her everything, Dad," he said. "She didn't even try to deny it. She just got angry that I found out at all." Claire's carefully built mask, it turned out, only worked as long as no one looked too closely. Once exposed, she stopped pretending entirely. She screamed at Owen that he owed her for 2 years of marriage, insisting she deserved compensation no matter what she'd done. She actually said that, Owen told me, his voice hollow with disbelief. Like discovering the truth was somehow the real crime here. Something in my chest finally loosened, not quite relief, but close to it. "What did you tell her?" I asked carefully. "I told her to call a lawyer," Owen said. "Because she's going to need one now." That night, Claire packed a bag and left the house they'd shared, still insisting loudly that she'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Owen called me afterward, exhausted but clear-eyed for the first time in months. "I should have listened to you sooner," he admitted. "You couldn't have," I told him. "You had to see it yourself. That's the only way it truly sticks." Claire filed for divorce 3 weeks later, demanding spousal support and a formal claim to what she called shared marital assets, despite having no legitimate legal grounds to touch a trust that had never once been transferred, commingled, or disclosed to her directly. Diane handled the entire filing personally, presenting the trust documents, the full timeline, and Helen's original stipulations proving the money had never legally entered the marriage in any form. Claire's own attorney, upon reviewing the evidence Marcus had carefully compiled, quietly advised her to withdraw the claim before it became part of the public record, a record that now included her documented past and her own written admissions. She refused to listen. Claire pushed forward anyway, apparently believing Owen would eventually fold rather than fight, the way he'd folded through most of their short marriage. She was completely wrong this time. In mediation, when directly confronted with her own written statement, Claire finally broke composure, accusing everyone in the room of conspiring against her, insisting loudly that she was the true victim in all of this. The mediator, entirely unmoved, noted for the record that her own prior documentation thoroughly undercut every claim she attempted to make that day. The final settlement left Claire with almost nothing beyond what she'd personally brought into the marriage, no spousal support, no claim to any future trust distributions, and a formal record permanently establishing she'd concealed material financial history during their engagement. Owen, for the first time in over a year, looked genuinely lighter walking out of that courthouse than I'd seen him in ages. "It's finally over," he said, standing on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun. "Really over." I placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "It's actually just starting," I said. "The good part, I mean." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him since long before Claire entered his life. That evening, I finally sat him down and walked him through the entire trust. $85 million his mother had quietly built over decades, meant not for extravagance but for the steady life she'd always hoped he'd build once he found someone who loved him for exactly who he was. Over the following months, Owen rebuilt his life with a clarity I hadn't seen in him in years. He used part of the trust to finally launch the small engineering firm he'd always dreamed about starting, something Claire had once dismissed as not practical enough for their lifestyle. He started dating again slowly, cautiously choosing to keep the trust completely private until real trust was firmly established first, a lesson learned the hardest possible way. Claire, meanwhile, found her documented history increasingly difficult to outrun. Word travels quickly in certain circles, and prospective partners now had easy access to public records painting a clear, damning pattern of behavior. Marcus heard through mutual contacts that 2 more of her attempted relationships had ended abruptly the moment men did basic background research beforehand. The predator who once thrived entirely on secrecy found herself undone by the very same silence she'd once tried weaponizing against us. Owen, for his part, never wasted energy chasing revenge fantasies of his own. She did this to herself, he told me one evening, watching the sunset from his new office balcony. I don't need to do anything else at all. A year later, Owen stood at the opening of his very first major engineering project, a community water facility funded partly through Helen's trust, quietly dedicated in her name alone. Standing beside him, I felt something finally settle in my chest that had remained unsettled since the day her lawyer first handed me that folder. You did the right thing, Owen told me, looking out over the small crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Staying quiet, I mean. I know it wasn't easy for you. Your mother taught me that real love reveals itself through patience, I said. I simply followed her lead the whole way. Claire, we later heard, moved to another state entirely, presumably searching for her next opportunity, unaware that her own documented past now followed her like a shadow she could never fully outrun again. Owen, meanwhile, built a steady life entirely on his own terms, deliberate, grounded, and finally surrounded by people who valued him for exactly who he truly was. Standing there watching my son cut that ribbon, I thought of Helen, of her quiet decades of patience, and of the promise I'd made to protect everything she'd built until the right moment finally arrived, with truth exposed, greed defeated, and my son standing taller than he ever had before.